Okay, in this lecture, we're going to talk about lead and its association with neurotoxicity, causing brain damage, impairing cognitive function. And what's going on in the background is I'm starting to study a lot more of the details of what causes cognitive impairment in people. I've already studied it a ton, but I'm going back through more of the basic science, kind of putting it all together. I have my own theory of it. I think I've actually figured it out, but I'm just filling in some of the details, and I'm making these videos along the way. Okay, so what's worthwhile knowing about lead? Lead basically will have a 2+ valence, like calcium, and it'll mimic calcium inside the human body, and it damages a lot of metabolic pathways. Of our interest especially will be that it inhibits electron transport in the mitochondria, especially at the level of cytochrome C and at the level of ATP synthase. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's involved in all this. And then why should you care? Because there's multiple different things that impair mitochondrial function, and that's thought to be one of the main causes of aging, of cancer, and of dementia. And again, the good news is a lot of this stuff is avoidable, and even if you can't totally avoid exposure to lead, you can't totally avoid exposure to cadmium, by optimizing all your other health habits and diet, you can minimize their effect. And in the back of your mind, you should say to yourself, well, there's people in Okinawa that are 105 years old with no medical problems. Why can't I be like that? Versus what I see in my experience dealing with a lot of American patients is they just think it's normal to be fat, sick, diabetic, hypertensive, and cognitive impaired in their 50s. It's not. That means you're screwing up typically, okay? All right, a little bit more about lead. It comes from the Latin word plumbum, and that's why the chemical symbol is Pb. They use it in their plumbing pipes. And that's also part of the fall of the Roman Empire, is a lot of people were cognitively impaired from high lead levels from having their plumbing with lead. It also caused decreased IQ and infertility and etc. All right, sources of lead. Lead gas was phased out by about 1996 in America. Lead paint in houses by about 1978. The lead paint was a problem because kids would sometimes break off a chip and chew on it. Plus, it would create lead dust in the house. Kid crawls around on the floor, gets lead on their hands. They're always putting stuff in their mouth, getting lead exposure. Another thing people don't know is lipstick is a very common to have lead paint in it and contain lead. There was one study where I saw over 100 lipsticks were tested, and every single one of them had lead in it. Lead painted toys. Those have been banned since 2008, but, be careful. Kids don't really need much. I've raised 4 kids, okay? You don't need to give them much. They just like a little attention from their parents, and they'll play with a, cardboard box or something. They don't need fancy, expensive stuff. That's not what makes them happy. All right, lead in foods. Even organic. I wouldn't buy something organic from China. And, if this guy, Mike Adams, wrote a book called Food Forensics. Where's the book? Here it is. It's a pretty good book. And he has a whole bunch of charts at the end about how much lead and cadmium and other things, there's a look at that chart, are in different foods. It's a pretty incomplete list, but it's still good. Let's see, what else? Lead in drinking water. The big famous story was Flint, Michigan in 2016. The pediatricians were finding high lead levels in the blood of kids. There's been problems with lead in infant formulas, infant cereals. So you can check stuff. For example, we had a bunch of painted plates in our house, for eating off of, and I tested them all with lead, tested them all for lead. They were negative. My wife said I was a paranoid a-hole jerk, but you know what? I want to know. I won't even eat off a painted plate. Why not? I like clear glass, okay? It works. I won't eat off a plastic plate. Why should I? Let's see. Food dyes, well, they're allowed to contain some lead. Food preservatives are often allowed to contain some lead. It's another reason not to eat processed food. I recommend 0 processed food. Okay, lead air pollution from mining, smelting, battery factory soldering, any type of industrial factory place is usually going to have a high level of air pollution. Try to avoid those areas if you can. Agricultural pesticides, they used to routinely contain lead. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about mechanisms of lead toxicity. And well, first of all, lead's associated with stuff outside the brain. Hypertension, it'll inhibit heme synthesis for making hemoglobin, and so it'll cause anemia. It's associated with increased risk of kidney failure, infertility, peripheral neuropathy in adults. Okay, Fine, but where does it get more interesting? The fact that it has a 2+ charge on it, just like calcium, but also like the typical iron, zinc, manganese, they're all 2+ in their charge. They're valence. Lead can cross the blood-brain barrier, can go through the so-called divalent metal ion transporter, so it can get into the brain, and then it can start causing problems in the brain. It can actually pass through calcium ion channels and get into brain cells, into your brain neurons. It can interact with calcium binding proteins, and calcium is really essential for a lot of metabolic processes in the brain. I especially found it interesting that it can block electron transport. We'll show another picture of this in just one sec, but that's a big deal because you've got multiple things that can impair your mitochondrial function, and that's a big deal because lack of mitochondria, cells die, or you become cognitively impaired or get cancer. All kinds of bad stuff happens with mitochondrial impairment. Lead can block mitochondrial uptake of calcium, and then calcium will be more likely to accumulate in the cytoplasm. Not good. That activates a whole bunch of pathways. We talked about that before in the lectures on excitotoxicity. Lead also can bind the zinc receptor on NMDA receptor for glutamate. So that's all fancy talk, but what it means is it's damaging many normal processes in your brain. That's why it lowers IQ. It also binds to glutathione, and it will deplete this. Glutathione is an essential antioxidant. So once you're becoming depleted in antioxidants, the brain can no longer protect itself effectively from oxidative stress, from lipid peroxidation. We talked recently in the lecture about omega-6 cooking oils causing lipid peroxidation. The more antioxidant capacity you have from eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, the more you can prevent those things and minimize them. Avoid oils and eat your fruits and vegetables, get your antioxidants, and you'll be in pretty good shape. Children have a more permeable blood-brain barrier, so these things are all worse in kids. The brain's developing, they're more vulnerable. It can lead to kids, that are exposed to a lot of lead, lowered IQ, hyperactivity, inappropriate aggression. My recommendation, avoid lead whenever you can. Be careful about it. Eat low fat, low sodium, the whole routine. Plant-based diet, no sweets, no caffeine, no alcohol. Exercise, get your sun, all that stuff. Okay, here's some pictures. And this is just showing the electron transport chain within the inner mitochondrial membrane. So the electrons are passed down the pathway until they get to oxygen. Okay, oxygen is the ultimate electron acceptor, and protons are pumped into intermembranous space between the inner mitochondrial membrane and the outer mitochondrial membrane. And then when this gradient is built up, the gradient is harvested to make ATP. Well, lead, Pb for lead, plumum, it blocks cytochrome C, and it blocks ATP synthase. So when ATP synthase is blocked, you can't make ATP. Cells run out of energy. They can't do what they need to do. And then it's bad enough that lead can do that, but lead's not that common. However, here's how it happens in real life. Things are multifactorial. Cadmium is inhibiting complex 3 of electron transport on the inner mitochondrial membrane. High-fat diets also inhibiting complex 3 of electron transport. That's what you see with diabetes. Then F- is inhibiting complex 4. And here is with all of these mitochondrial inhibitors together. So fat, cadmium, Pb, F-, and you can see they're adding up. It's hard for this cell to produce enough energy. When a brain cell doesn't have enough energy, it will typically go into apoptosis. It just dies. It says, I can't meet my metabolic demands. And rather than have a calamitous death, it goes into programmed cell death of apoptosis to try to recycle its chemicals so that they can be used by other cells. But the bottom line is the person is losing brain cells. And that's, again, why am I so careful about nutrition and health? Because I know that this is what's happening. And if you optimize all your health habits, you can really minimize it a lot. So there's a good motivating reason to do so. Out of all these articles, the best one on mechanism of lead neurotoxicity was the first one. We talked about the book by Adams being pretty good, Food Forensics. This one, Unsafe at Any Meal, it's okay, but it's not as thorough, as scholarly of a book. Alzheimer Turning Point by Delatorre is a great book. It's one of the all-time best books on cognitive impairment, and then a whole bunch of papers. So hope that's helpful.